The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy.
Powerful words.
From Martin Luther King Jr., yeah. And they feel incredibly relevant as we get into today's topic. Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
So today we're really stepping into quite a significant discussion. We're going to unpack a critical analysis, one published recently in print.
Right.
And it takes a really hard look at India's near future, painting this picture of what it calls a potential decade of vulnerability.
And our goal here, our mission in this deep dive, is really to walk through that source material carefully with you. What are the specific global headwinds? What domestic challenges does this analysis actually identify? Why does it see the next 10 years as, well, particularly tricky?
And crucially, what's the path forward? What does the source suggest India can do to navigate this potentially difficult period? And look, this isn't just some abstract exercise. If you're tracking India's strategic position, or maybe you're a UPSC aspirant needing to synthesize complex current affairs for mains, even prelims.
We're just an engaged citizen wanting to stay informed.
Absolutely. Understanding this perspective is, I think, vital. The source's core idea is pretty stark, isn't it?
It is. It basically says the world's getting tougher for India.
Right. And handling it successfully. That really hinges on getting things right internally.
That's the connection it makes, yeah.
Okay, so let's start where the analysis does. The external environment.
Right.
It paints a pretty challenging global picture right away.
Right.
Describes it as a downward spiraling global order.
Yeah, not exactly confidence boosting, is it?
Not really.
And the source gets quite specific about where the pressure points are.
Like what?
Well, it highlights what it calls an increasing and significant threat from the China-Pakistan revisionist front.
Revisionist front. So not just the usual challenges, but something actively trying to change the status quo.
That's the implication, seeking to alter the regional balance.
And there's a specific point on Bangladesh, too, I recall.
Yes, quite a sharp one. It raises the possibility, just a possibility, mind you, that Bangladesh might align with this front. Maybe covertly or overtly is the phrase used, particularly after their next elections.
Wow. I mean, if that happened, that would fundamentally change India's neighborhood security picture, wouldn't it?
Completely reshape it, yeah.
And what about other global players?
Well, connecting the dots, Russia is expected to stay close to China, especially while the Ukraine conflict goes on.
So traditional calculations involving Russia might need rethinking.
Probably. And then looking west, the U.S., particularly under a potential Trump presidency, the analysis sees it as possibly unreliable.
Unreliable how?
It talks about transactional, soundbite-led politics, the suggestion being, India can't necessarily bank on consistent support or predictable policies from Washington.
Okay. Transactional. Got it. And West Asia inevitably comes up, I assume.
Oh, yes. It calls it a super hot spot.
No surprise there.
Driven by Iran-Israel tensions, obviously, but also what it terms deep religious animosities and long-term insecurities.
So high potential for volatility affecting trade, energy, all of that.
Exactly. It's a region where things could flare up fast.
So putting it all together.
Yeah.
China, Pakistan, maybe Bangladesh shifting, Russia aligned with China, U.S. potentially unpredictable, volatile West Asia.
The analysis basically argues India is facing a much less stable, potentially more hostile global stage than before.
Right. And that external pressure is a big reason why the source labels this a decade of vulnerability.
That's a key part of the argument, yes.
Okay, so that's the challenging external picture. But as you said, the analysis argues navigating this really depends on India's internal state. And it flags two specific internal vulnerabilities, things that are concerned sort of now and in the near future. What's the first?
Okay, the first vulnerability is about the economy, India's economic growth trajectory.
Right.
And the source makes this really interesting comparison, I think.
Oh, yeah. What's the comparison?
It points out how historical economic powerhouses, think post-war, Europe, Japan, the Asian tigers, China more recently.
Okay.
They all benefited hugely from, well, basically U.S. blessing and support during their high growth phases. Active help, often.
Right. That makes sense. And the point is?
The point, according to this analysis, is that India won't have that same tailwind. In fact, it makes a pretty bold claim that both the U.S. and China might actually try to slow India's growth.
Actively try to slow it. Why?
viewing India more as a competitor, perhaps, in certain areas, rather than just a partner.
Okay, so no helping hand, maybe even some hindrance.
Which means, the source argues, the pressure internal and external stays intense until we become a $10 trillion economy and generate lots of quality jobs.
Getting to that scale is seen as crucial for resilience, for influence.
It's essential, yes.
And the timeline the analysis gives for hitting that $10 trillion mark.
A decade, if not more, even under the best of circumstances.
Which ties right back into this idea of a decade of vulnerability, the time needed to build that economic muscle.
Precisely. It's the period before reaching that scale that's seen as vulnerable.
Okay. And the second, internal vulnerability.
The second one is defense capabilities, specifically in the short term.
Right. Now, the analysis does acknowledge things are improving, right? More indigenous production.
Yes, definitely. It acknowledges that improvement and the push for self-reliance at Manor Bharat, that's positive.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, the but is time. The reality of defense cycles, building advanced systems takes years.
Sure.
It uses the example of the AMCA, the Advanced Stealth Fighter.
Yeah.
Says it could take, 10 years just to develop and deploy properly.
And presumably the same for advanced warships, submarines, or things needed for power projection?
Exactly. Those also have long lead times.
So what's the specific short-term concern then?
The critical concern raised is this. While India is on this, let's say, optimistic 10-year path for its own high-tech systems, China is already accelerating the rearming of Pakistan.
Now,
the analysis specifically mentions providing them with stealth fighters.
So Pakistan gets advanced capabilities before India fully fields its own comparable systems.
That's the worry. It creates this short-term window of vulnerability while India is playing catch-up on deploying its next-gen indigenous tech.
Okay, wow. So you've got this tough global scene pressing from outside, combined with internal pressure to grow fast without the old kind of support and the short-term defense gap.
It does sound like a tricky spot. Yeah.
So how does the analysis suggest India gets through this? What's the solution proposed?
Okay, this is where the analysis really pivots to its core message, I think.
Right.
It states quite clearly these challenges can be overcome. But the key isn't just external maneuvering or even just economic policy alone.
What is it then?
It requires, and this is the direct quote, sheer political will and, crucially, greater political consensus.
Okay, so it comes down to internal politics, political will, and consensus.
That's identified as the absolute key variable. The argument is, without that broad consensus, the big reforms needed.
Reforms for what, exactly?
To really accelerate growth, achieve genuine self-reliance, especially in defense manufacturing, those reforms will just stay stuck.
They won't get off the ground without everyone pulling in the same direction, basically.
Exactly. They won't get the momentum needed to counter those external pressures and shore up the internal vulnerabilities.
And how does the analysis view the current political climate in relation to this need for consensus?
Well, it's pretty blunt, actually.
Uh-oh.
It suggests political parties kind of across the board are seen as too busy spending resources on freebies to win elections.
Okay.
And often working at cross purposes rather than uniting on these critical long-term national goals.
Working against each other instead of together.
That's the picture painted.
This leads to that interesting idea the analysis mentions, the 0.5 front.
Yeah.
What exactly did it mean by that?
Yeah, that was interesting. It's defined not just as, traditional secessionist groups,
Right.
but much more broadly. It's any debilitating political opposition that could thwart forward movement on reforms.
So that could be anything from blocking laws in Parliament to, say, street protests, forcing policy changes, anything that causes political gridlock on reforms.
That seems to be the definition used here. Anything that stops necessary change.
And linked to that, the source also said something about rhetoric, doesn't it? About calling the opposition names.
Yes, it makes the point that, look, if you need consensus, then calling the opposition anti-national serves no useful purpose.
Because it just deepens the divides you need to bridge.
Precisely. It seems to argue that kind of language is counterproductive if unity is the goal.
What I found particularly insightful, maybe even a bit depressing, was the observation about why these divisions are so deep.
What was that?
The analysis suggests it's not always about fundamental policy differences.
Oh.
It argues the conflicts gain this intractable edge because of political ego clashes and deep personal animosities.
Personality politics over policy substance.
Exactly. And it gives the specific example of the deep distrust Narendra Modi and Rahul Gandhi have for one another.
Right. Even though, as the source points out, their actual policies when in power, maybe not that different on some big things.
Yeah, it notes the Modi government continued major Congress initiatives like DBT, Aadhaar, MGN, Rijye, maybe with some tweaks.
Which suggests the gridlock might be less about ideology and more about, well, personalities and power struggles.
Which makes the need for consensus perhaps even more urgent, but also maybe, just maybe, more achievable if the political will was there to overcome those personal clashes.
That's a hopeful way to look at it, yeah, if the will is there.
So how does the analysis suggest this vital consensus can actually be built? It seems to put the responsibility mainly on the government, right? Specifically the PM.
Yes, the argument is the initiative has to come from the top. It uses that recent example. Operation Sindor, was it? The all-party delegation.
Right, for supporting workers abroad.
And it highlights that sour note when Congress objected to certain delegates, mentioning Shashi Tharoor specifically.
Okay. And the analysis's point was?
The analysis makes the direct claim that, quote, a simple phone call from the Prime Minister to Rahul Gandhi could have resolved the issue before it became a public spat.
But that didn't happen.
Apparently not. The government went ahead and sent Tharoor despite the objections.
And the source uses this specific instance to make a broader point about
How political capital is being used.
Mhm.
Is it being used to build bridges, to facilitate cooperation, or are opportunities for consensus being missed, maybe even deliberately ignored?
Okay. So build bridges, don't burn them. And which areas need these consensus-driven reforms most urgently, according to the source?
It lists several key areas needing reforms and deregulation. Defense manufacturing, agriculture, land, and labor laws.
The really big, thorny ones.
Exactly. And also the police, legal, judicial system.
Right. And these aren't just economic reforms, are they?
No, it stresses these non-economic reforms are crucial, not just nice to have for hitting that $10 trillion economy target faster.
Why? How do things like land laws or the judicial system impact growth so directly?
Well, think about it. Archaic land rules, rigid labor laws, a slow legal system, they all massively impact the ease of doing business, don't they?
Sure. Investor confidence, setting up factories,
Yeah.
creating jobs.
Exactly. Without reforming those foundations, the analysis argues accelerating the economy becomes much, much harder.
And even if you get consensus, these reforms take time to work, right?
You do. The source estimates 3 to 5 years to start delivering results.
Which means you need sustained focus.
Yes. It argues you need a prime minister who is fully engaged with this reform agenda, not constantly pulled away by short-term political compulsions like, endless electioneering.
And the analysis acknowledges the current PM has significant political capital.
Oh, yes. Ample political capital, it says. More than many predecessors.
But, another but.
The big question, as the source puts it, is whether he will use it sparingly more to win elections than to build consensus.
That's framed as the central choice for the leadership. Power for elections or power for reforms.
That's the dilemma presented.
And there was a specific criticism mentioned about how meetings are handled.
Yes, the analysis points critically to leaving important all-party meetings to lieutenants, with the PM seldom appearing personally.
Staying so far above the battle was the phrase.
That's it. Instead of using his personal political weight to forge consensus on tough issues, the analysis calls this not a healthy sign for navigating this vulnerable period.
Interesting. Even while acknowledging that most policies are seen as broadly correct.
Yes, policies are seen as mostly in the right direction, though it does criticize the expansion of freebie culture.
Okay.
But the overall conclusion from the source here is that given the stakes, given the vulnerability, the PM needs to focus squarely on these strategic threats and challenges.
And even consider giving more power away.
Yes, potentially devolving more power to states and local bodies. To empower them, maybe reduce central overload.
Okay, let's try and connect these threads. The analysis doesn't just list problems. It links the internal political situation directly to those external challenges we started with.
It does. It asks some really pointed questions to show the consequences of this political inertia.
Like what?
Like, how can you maintain focus on vital national security stuff, defense buildup, alliances, when political energy is constantly drained by domestic crises?
Things like angry farmers landing up on Delhi's doorstep.
Exactly. Or persistent law and order issues, or a dilatory judicial process that slows everything down.
Or how do you attract investment and manufacturing if you're dealing with, say, rest of minority population, or if those unreformed land and labor laws make business unpredictable.
It really highlights the drag these internal issues create.
Which ties back to that idea of devolving power. Right?
Yes, it floats the idea of maybe fully devolving agriculture to the states, letting the center just manage national buffer stocks of essential things.
Grains, petroleum, rare earths.
Right. The argument seems to be, let states handle what they can handle best. Free up the center to focus on the big strategic picture.
And what about the money side? Fiscal issues.
Well, it asks, how does the constant state-level issue of cribbing about the lack of resources, partly due to central schemes, partly their own spending?
And those freebies draining state coffers.
Right. How does all that impact national fiscal stability, which, is fundamental for economic confidence?
And at the local level, urban governance?
Poor urban governance, bad infrastructure. The source links that directly to hindering job creation, which is critical for absorbing the youth bulge and hitting that $10 trillion goal.
It feels like a whole interconnected system where blockages in one area affect everything else.
That's very much the sense you get from the analysis.
Now, the source also made a comment about the government potentially losing its reform momentum.
Yes, it suggests the government might have lost its reform mojo a bit after the second term began.
What examples did it give?
The reversal of the farm laws after the protests, street pressure, and putting the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act, in abeyance.
And it mentioned privatization, too.
Yeah, a telling detail. The P-word privatization has gone missing from the discourse after the Air India sale was done.
And there was a paradox mentioned about getting reforms done, even in states ruled by the same party as the center.
Yes, a fascinating point. The difficulty in getting even BJP-ruled states to push through tough reforms.
Why would that be?
The analysis speculates it's just speculation, but maybe local leaders feel just praising the PM is enough for their political survival.
So less incentive to do the hard, potentially unpopular work of actual reform on the ground.
Perhaps, while at the same time the opposition's main strategy seems to be offering even more freebies to try and beat the PM.
So the political incentives everywhere seem kind of misaligned with the long-term reforms the analysis says are crucial.
That's the picture it paints, yeah. A difficult political dynamic for driving deep change.
Okay, so with all these challenges, this gridlock, these consequences, what does the analysis actually propose as the way out? How does India navigate this?
Well, the path forward, according to this source, really circles back to leadership and using that political capital we talked about.
The Prime Minister again.
Yes. It argues the PM must use his significant political weight to actively push these needed reforms, not just at the center.
Within the states, too.
Crucially, in all states, regardless of who is in power there, BJP or opposition.
That sounds politically very difficult.
Extremely. And the analysis suggests it might require the center to actually shed some of its excess powers.
Give power away to gain cooperation.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Show willingness to empower states and mention specific examples, like reining in governors, presumably to reduce friction between the center and state governments, and the PM personally stepping up on really sensitive issues like delimitation, the redrawing of electoral boundaries.
Things that need serious political muscle.
Exactly. The source stresses these tough jobs can't just be left to ministers who might lack the political heft to build that cross-party consensus and navigate state politics.
The analysis also touched on the balancing act with China, didn't it?
Yes, that very difficult balancing act, needing to keep engaging Beijing for equitable trade deals because the economic links are there.
But at the same time,
simultaneously needing to rapidly build up military muscle to deter any adventurism, engage and deter.
a tough tightrope to walk.
Very. And the analysis notes that domestic politics can make it harder. Opposition criticism, like that old surrender jibe, or general accusations of weakness.
Makes the government's position more difficult when trying to balance engagement and deterrence.
That's the implication, especially when, as the source puts it, China's hand-holding of Islamabad's armaments was unmistakable. After incidents like Pahalgam, we're just reporting the source's view here, of course.
Understood. So the analysis seems to boil down to a fundamental question for the leadership.
Yes, a really profound one that suggests the PM needs to ask himself, what is the use of all my prestige and political capital if it ultimately does not get things done for the country?
Wow. Prioritize national outcomes over just holding on to power.
That's the call. It's a call to get his politics right.
And there was that metaphor.
The striking one, yeah. The 56-inch chest must disclose an open heart to win over the opposition in the interests of the country.
So, not weakness, but strategic openness for national unity on key issues.
That seems to be the idea. Forge unity for critical priorities.
The analysis even suggested the PM might need to shift his own focus, delegate more.
It did. It floated the idea of maybe letting others, a second-in-command, strong state leaders or satraps, handle the day-to-day election winning.
Why?
To allow them to grow politically, but more importantly, to free up the PM's own time, energy, and political capital.
To focus on those huge national tasks.
Right.
Defense, economy, consensus building.
Exactly. The existential stuff, you could say.
And the summary line for governance was?
Very memorable. India doesn't just need double-engine Sarkars. Same party at center and state.
Yes.
3 engines firing in sync at the central, state, and local levels to boost growth.
Central, state, and local, all working together.
That's the vision for breaking through.
So the overall message from this source, it's pretty sobering, isn't it?
It is. India is entering a potentially vulnerable decade. External pressures, internal issues.
And navigating it successfully needs a major shift in political focus.
Yeah.
A leadership fully engaged with the real threats and challenges, global and domestic.
And crucially, not distracted by narrow politics, just aimed at the next election cycle.
Wow. Okay. That was a really deep dive into a very complex and, like you said, challenging analysis.
It really covered a lot of ground. The global pressures, those specific internal vulnerabilities, economic, defense.
The huge emphasis on political will and consensus.
The barriers to achieving it, and then that proposed path forward really centered on leadership choices and reforms.
And understanding this kind of layered analysis. I mean, this is exactly why staying informed is so important. For anyone listening who's preparing for exams like the UPSC, being able to connect these dots, global, internal, economic, security, political, like this source does, that's gold dust for your mains essays, even for prelims understanding.
And for all of us, really, just to be informed citizens understanding the forces shaping the country's path.
It definitely pushes you to think critically, doesn't it, about how interconnected everything is.
It does. So what do you listening think? Do you agree with this assessment of vulnerability for the next decade?
What about the proposed solutions? Building consensus, pushing reforms. Does that resonate with you?
What part of this analysis really stood out for you? Was it the external picture, the internal issues, or maybe that focus on political dynamics being the key?
We genuinely want to hear your thoughts.
We really do.
If you found this deep dive useful, if it helped you break down this complex analysis and grasp the nuances, please do show your support.
Give us a like. It really helps. Subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss our future deep dives.
And definitely leave a comment below. Your thoughts, your questions, maybe ideas for future topics you want us to unpack. Your engagement is what makes this possible.
It really is.
Thank you so much for joining us for this unpacking of a really significant piece of analysis.
Thanks, everyone.
So as we wrap up, maybe one final thought to leave you with, building on what the source discussed.
Okay.
Given the level of political friction the analysis describes, and that perceived short-term focus everywhere, how realistic is it to achieve the kind of national consensus the source says is essential in today's climate?
That's a tough question.
And if that consensus proves really hard to get, what other options might India have, pathways maybe not mentioned in the source, to still navigate this vulnerable decade and somehow get those 3 engines, center, state, local firing together?
Something to definitely mull over after the discussion ends.
Indeed. A challenging thought to end on. Thanks again for tuning in to the Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another analysis to explore.
Until next time.